Okay, so thank you for joining us. This is Working Groups 2 presentation on Towards a Framework to Support the Design of Esports Curricula in Higher Education. I'm Dr. Michael Scott, and I'm joined here with my colleague, Dr. Rory Summerley, both of us currently at Falmouth University in the United Kingdom. Rory, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hey everyone. It's nice to be here. This is my first ITiCSE and I'm enjoying it so far.
Right, thanks, Rory. So, of course, we were joined by many other members of the working group, and I'd just like to thank everyone for their contributions. We were joined by Nicholas Bessoms, Cornelia Connolly, Joey Jaraskrik, Tsipora Halevi, Seth Jenny, Michael Benlanovic, Melissa Stange, Tony Typalis, and J. Patrick Williams, who were joining us from various different regions of the world, including North America, Europe, and Asia. And here is a picture of us in one of our working group meetings, which took place over the past 2 months. So, pictured here in the background is a photograph provided by Kevin Tao. It's a picture of the Key Arena in Seattle during a Dota 2 tournament, illustrating the presence that esports is gaining at the moment. And as it is a growing industry, it is spurring higher education institutions to develop new degree programs which are catering to it. But we found that there's currently little guidance for curriculum developers, and interestingly, a lack of discourse in the computing education community about esports. In fact, I don't think it is mentioned in any curricular documents published by either the IEEE or the ACM. So this working group is acting to stimulate discourse on esports and what the study of esports should look like in the future. And we're starting to lay the foundations for a framework that will support the design of future esports curricula in higher education contexts. Now, you might ask, why is this pertinent to computing education? Because esports is, of course, more varied than just computing. And during our various surveys, literature reviews, and discussions, we discovered that there is considerable interdisciplinarity in that sector. However, computing does play a considerable role in esports, and the interface that computing departments will have in the future with esports education, particularly in higher education institutions, I suspect will be non-trivial. And I hypothesize that the interface will be far more varied and far more complex than what we currently see, for example, with the games industry. Now, the outline structure of the rest of this presentation and in the paper itself is we've got some background material for people who are currently unfamiliar with esports. It's essentially asking the question, what should educators know about esports if they want to wade into this area? We've done a fairly comprehensive literature review on esports context. We've looked at esports careers as they are at the moment, taking a snapshot of the space as it stands this month. We've got esports education and the current...
I'm good.
Sorry, we'll just ask everybody to mute their mics if they're not presenting. Apologies about that.
Yeah, so we did a survey of the esports education landscape, and we looked at particular detail at 65 courses which we identified. And we have started to form our esports curricular framework. It is still in its infancy, but we're at the stage now where we're starting to synthesize some recommendations. So Rory, if I hand over to you to present the background and context sections.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. So as Mike just mentioned, we are kind of writing this from the perspective of thinking about an audience of educators who don't necessarily know a lot about esports, either for many of you probably working in the sort of computing subject area or other subject areas that esports touches upon through its interdisciplinary nature. So there are some important questions to address first off with the background. So we address things like, what is esports to begin with? Because the definition of esports quite contentious and somewhat nebulous at times. Why is esports important, which is often kind of touted in terms of financial importance. But we are hoping to also kind of make it clear that esports is quite culturally important, particularly impactful in terms of media consumption amongst younger generations. Esports is often seen as kind of a domain that's spearheading a lot of live streaming and video on demand media entertainment that younger generations are engaging with. And so it is important not just in terms of growing finances, but also just in terms of what are we going to be making in terms of entertainment for people going forward. How does esports connect to education? Well, as we've mentioned, esports is a site of a lot of different disciplines crossing over each other. From our literature review on the industry so far, we can see that lots and lots of different types of disciplines are kind of coming into contact with each other in new ways with esports. And so in terms of education, there's a lot of potential to build in interdisciplinarity as well as sort of graduateness for those students wishing to study esports or similar domains such as live streaming or live digital events management, for instance. There's also the interesting question that is somewhat raised by the fact that not everyone in our working group is an expert on esports necessarily, which is very useful for us because it kind of gives us an idea of kind of what we need to explain, what we need to cover. And it's worth remembering that esports is kind of like sports. It's not just one game or sport that people play, it's a lot of different sports. And so the question of how what we are teaching relates to that as a subject area is quite important to consider. And although there are quite a lot of esports, we tended to try and break it down by genre to begin with, because we would be here all day if we were listing every single one. We can move to the next slide, Mike. So getting into kind of the deeper and more detailed context around esports, we're asking here, what broader considerations should educators make about esports? So that's aside from just thinking about how are students going to get careers in esports, or what are the pedagogical considerations specifically. So what we needed to establish was kind of where does esports happen, who is involved with it. At its core, it's primarily driven by players or communities who are likely made up of a lot of players, but also people who play in a very casual way or spectate or just engage with whatever game that is being played in the esports community, sort of on the sidelines or just in forming a broader community. From our literature review and from our esports researchers who understand esports history, we know that communities usually pop up around esports whether or not the game intended them or not. And as that's grown over time, we've seen that there are a larger number of interested stakeholders sort of popping up around the field. And they're not necessarily all in the same domain. So we're getting a lot of content creators, we're getting a lot of people doing sort of entrepreneurial work, setting up businesses, as well as kind of organizing events and thinking about how to kind of propagate a communal sport. I'll just hand it back to Mike because I've seen we've got the 1 minute warning there. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so we surveyed 1,533 job adverts to try and identify career pathways. So quickly summarizing: performance and health management, organization management, events organization, casting, presenting, broadcast management, IT, digital communications and marketing, support functions and services, esport, dev and maintenance, education, journalism, and the actual playing of the games. We mapped this out into a diagram with the help of Nicholas Bescombe, who's been working on this mapping exercise for quite some time. And we pulled out some of the job titles which are prominent in the field. And we also looked at the frequency of the different career pathways. So as we can see, areas like esport development and maintenance, digital communications, information technology are all quite prominent areas of the esports space, with also broadcast management and events organization being expectedly important. We then looked at those 65 courses in more detailed and looked at how they aligned with those career opportunities, identifying that a considerable proportion of the courses focus on support functions, organizational management, and digital communications. We also found that most of the courses were quite broad, with about a third of them being focused on a particular career pathway, with only a small percentage of them being highly specialized. So based on this, we've started to construct our framework and make some recommendations. Rory, do you want to briefly summarize where we're at thus far?
So obviously we're only just beginning our analysis of the data that we've been collecting. So the recommendations we're looking at thus far are sort of early hypotheses, early themes that seem to be emerging from the research we've done, but they need to be kind of rigorously scrutinized. But so far we are kind of looking at a few things like how interdisciplinarity is communicated to the student in terms of expectations of the course, and which way the course is generally specializing amongst other concerns. And I think that brings us back to the end, or was there one more? Yeah, pretty much. So thank you all for listening.